Hello, today is March 10th, 2021. I'm meeting today with Mr. Robert Frank at his home in Greeley, Colorado. My name is Brad Hoops. I'm the interviewer for the Northern Colorado Veterans History Project. Welcome, Robert, and thanks for sitting down today to tell your story.
I hope it'll be a pleasure.
Oh, I'm sure it will be, no doubt about it. Let's start out, if we could. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your date of birth, where you were born, a little bit about your family.
All right. I was born on October the 26th, 1931, on a farm northwest of Windsor. My parents were both German Russian immigrants coming to this country in 1907. I'm the youngest of four brothers, or four total brothers, and we lived in the Windsor area till I started first grade. Then we moved to Loveland, and I got all my schooling there. I did not graduate, however, from high school. We lived on a farm that's surrounded by Horseshoe Lake, and I grew up as a farm kid, and I was farming with my dad when I got drafted in the Korean War. I did get one deferment, so I was inducted in April of '52.
You got an agricultural deferment?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And so I was inducted in 1952.
Well, what was that like? Let's back up a little bit. We can back up quite a bit. There's a whole story we could tell about the Germans from Russia. That's that in itself is a pretty incredible story, I think. My side of the family is as well. But what was it like as a child? Talk a little bit about your childhood growing up the farm. For those of us, 80 years or 90 years, 80 years later that don't know anything about farm life back in the day.
Well, if you can imagine, their idea of utopia coming from Russia was to come to this part of the country and work sugar beets.
That's tough
work. That's not a very high ideal. They weren't shooting for the moon, definitely. And at that time, to immigrate, they had to have a sponsor, so as they would not be wards of the state. And
so was it your grandparents then that migrated?
Yes.
Okay.
And my parents, my dad was 7 and my mother was 5.5.
Oh, when they came over?
Right.
Oh, wow.
In 1907. Apparently they came late winter, early spring. They both landed at Galveston, Texas. And of course they came on freight ships. They didn't pay passenger rates. The cheapest way to get there was how they got there. My mother didn't really remember anything about Russia. And if I'd asked my dad, he'd say, "Why do you even want to talk about a place like that?" But the one thing I asked him, well, how'd they get there? And he didn't remember all of it either. But they went from where they lived to Saratov, Russia. And apparently they got on a train there and went to Germany. Some other people I know migrated from there, and they got on a ship at Bremerhaven, Germany. But my dad doesn't seem to remember anything about a railroad. But I said, well, how'd you get from Denhof was the name of their town. How'd you get from there to Saratov? And he said, well, Dad hired a man with a sled. And he said, well, when the wolves would get too close, he'd throw out some meat or something for them. And so that's how they got there. And he didn't, well, when they got to Galveston, they wouldn't let his father off of the ship because he'd got his eyes sunburned. He spent every waking moment up on deck hoping to see a whale. which he never did. But so they wouldn't let him off of the ship in Galveston. They stayed on the ship for 2 weeks till his eyes cleared up. At that time, it was a eye disease, I guess something like pink eye, but they had another name. And if you had a disease, they wouldn't let you off the ship.
Right.
You had to go back. And he said the entire 2 weeks they were there, they were busy loading bales of cotton onto this ship. But anyhow, in 2 weeks his eyes cleared up and he was able to come. And they went directly to Loveland.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And his ship was the Professor... No, I can't think of it.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah.
And my mother came on a different ship. The funny thing she told about it is every family had a teapot and a pea pot. And she said these things would slide back and forth across the floor constantly. I think they had to bring their own food with them.
Jeez.
So the best they could have would be, of course, dry bread and some cured sausage or something. And so they definitely didn't have a buffet line to go through or anything like that. And I asked my mother about it, and she said, well, or how they came here, and she said, well, the sugar factory had recruiters over there. And that would have been Great Western Sugar. To get people to come over here and raise and work sugar beets. And I understand the Union Pacific Railroad did the same thing because they had all this land that the government gave them, and they wanted to sell that land and get people there that would ship freight and so forth.
Right.
So that's why most of these Russian Germans settled along the rivers where there was irrigation or where the railroad was to work for the railroad. At least that's my understanding of it.
And how long before, they started extremely humble beginnings, how long did it take them to get that first farm?
Well, my grandfather, I don't know when he bought a farm, but he died in 32, and he'd already had 2 farms at that time. But he had lost one of them. My dad said, well, he wouldn't have had to do that, but he was just afraid of too much debt, and he'd let the mortgage company take one of them back. And this farm was right on the east side of Horseshoe Lake.
Oh, okay.
Between Horseshoe and Boyd Lake.
Okay.
And so anyhow, they tried to get things put together right away. My dad tells the first year they were here, him and this other Frank, they bought a 2-room tar paper shack in the east side of Loveland for $500, and the 2 families spent the winter there.
Oh, man.
My dad's family, there was 6 kids at that time, and the other side didn't have quite that many, but maybe 3 or 4 or whatever. And he remembered that on Christmas Day it was so warm that year that they could have the door open. So as Yakov Smirnov would say, "What a country!" So yeah, they. I don't know when my granddad would have bought the first farm, but in the 20s sometime. Probably only 10 or 12 years after they'd been in this country.
That's amazing. Yeah.
And so, anyhow, that's the history of my background.
Yeah. How? What was it like with you growing up on the farm? And
well,
talk a little bit about that and some memories you might have.
See, I'm young enough. I don't really remember the Depression and the Dust Bowl era. Of course, we didn't have the Dust Bowl here because there was some irrigation. But my dad, from early on, had livestock, and he fed sheep and fed cattle and so forth, and worked with horses almost his entire life. Into when I left for the Army in 52, we still used a team of horses. But when I came back in 54, they were gone. And so I don't remember the really hard parts. My older brothers got in on all of it, the really hard labor, topping their own beats and thinning them, crawling them rows. And, you know, the Germans didn't use the short-handled hoe. They used the long-handled hoe. One person hoed and one person crawled and thinned them. At that time, sugar beets, the sugar beet seed is kind of like a tiny cucklebur, and each point grows a plant. So they planted with a planter that just strew them out quite thick. So with a hoe, you chopped about a 6-inch gap, and then there'd be 1 or 2 plants there, but they would have multiple plants on them. So when you crawled along, you had to pull all the plants except the best one. And then later on, they developed what they called segmented seed. That's when they broke up the seed so each little part would produce one plant, but they still were planted thick, and so you still had to hoe them and you still had to thin, because where you hoed there still might be several plants and you had to thin those out. And so farming was really fun. And when you got through thinning beets, then you hoed beets to hoe the weeds out of them, and corn. And by the time the corn got big enough, you'd be into July or somewhere in there. It was time to bind grain, so then you got to shock grain. And out in the middle of a grain field, when it's at least 100, it's really toasty out there. So that was the process. And of course, we mowed hay with horses and raked hay with horses and pushed up hay in a stack to a stack. And my older brothers did most of that, but my job when we were stacking hay was to run the stacker. It's called an overshot. It would buck up the hay on it, and then this thing would lift it up on the stack. Well, my dad being a horse guy, he had to feed the horses anyhow, so I should use the horses to pull the stacker up. It wasn't that it was a hard job or anything, but the horses would very soon learn about where the end of their run was, so they would always stop a little early. And if you hit them with the whip, they would lurch, and it would shoot the hay over too far. And if you didn't, it would drop off too soon and fall down in the stacker, and then you had to fork that back up and start over again. So I told my dad, I said, I suppose 12 or 13 or something by then. I said, well, we had a Dodge truck. I said, if you'd let me pull that up with the truck. He always worked on the stack, and my brothers would buck the hay. And I said, if you'd let me use the truck, I could put it in front or in back or in the middle. And so he finally consented to that. So that was then my job, to stack hay that way. And of course, when the thrashers came, and as it usually was, it was the time of the Loveland Fair. So most of the time I got to miss the parade and the other things. So when the thrashers came, well, then it was my job and Dad's job to scoop the grain into the granary. And I don't know, back then thrashers didn't make a terrific amount of yield, but I would imagine 1,500 or 2,000 bushels a day, and we had to scoop that in. You'd have 2 trucks or 2 wagons while it was filling this, and you had to get the other one empty to get back in time to do this. And so that's how I grew up.
Yeah.
And my dad always had livestock, so we always had to fork a lot of hay in the wintertime, and of course we put up silage, and all this was done by hand and so forth up until the later years.
Huh.
We didn't have a tractor and loader till in the early 50s. And
wow.
We'd had a good-sized tractor to do plowing because horses could not pull a plow in that area. The ground is just too tough, so forth. So,
well, moving forward now, prior to you getting called into service, you had World War II, and Korea was already going at it. What were your thoughts? I mean, knowing the stories. I don't know if any of your brothers had served in World War II, or
oh, yes.
And what were you feeling? Maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, but eventually we'll talk about what you were feeling, knowing all prior history of being in the military.
Well, I'm kind of a coward, and I realized people were getting killed over there.
Yeah.
So I kind of cheered when I got my first 6-month deferment. But I tried for a second one, and that didn't work. They said, well, you completed that year's crop, and that's it. I had 2 older brothers. My oldest brother was exempt because he was then married and farming on his own. But the next 2 brothers both served in Europe. Both of them getting there late in the war. They never got into the combat zone.
Oh, good.
And my next oldest brother was only over a short time. He got assigned to a unit, and his unit came back. My other brother didn't get consigned to a unit, and he served as an MP, and he was even the personal bodyguard for the British prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials.
Oh, really, yeah?
And so he said, well, while they were busy there, him and the Jeep driver, they roamed around looking and seeing whatever was going on. And he said he was directing traffic one time, and a French lady brought him a clump of grapes, and he said, well, that's where I learned to talk French. And I guess he can speak some French, but I don't know how much. So he was over there longer. And anyhow, when the Korean War started in 50, I knew it wasn't good. And some people had asked me, when did I enlist? And that was definitely the farthest thing from my mind.
Yeah, sure.
Before I got drafted, though, I don't know what he was an officer in the National Guard, came and tried to recruit me to the National Guard, and I just decided that I wouldn't do that. I'd take my chances. And so anyhow, I got drafted, and I got sent to Korea.
Where did you go off once? How soon after you got your draft notice were you sent off, and where did you go for basic?
Well, I was drafted, I believe it was in April, and there was 5 of us got on the bus at Fort Collins. But there was one guy had come down from Montana, and another fellow in Camp Saratoga, Wyoming. And then I think there was 3 of us from Lerner County. And of course we got on the bus and went to Denver, and that's where they wrapped us on the knee and let us pee in the bottle and all this sort of stuff. And I think it was in the same day they put us on the train, and we went to Camp Crowder, Missouri. I know we got on the train. It was the Denver-Chicago Zephyr. And they just pulled out of Denver and stopped and fed us supper on the train. And then we rode the train, I think, to Kansas City. And that train was so rough I couldn't believe they'd keep it on the track. It just jumped and shook and everything. And the conductor said, well, we're traveling 104 miles an hour. And So we got to Kansas City, I believe it was, late at night. And then they put us on a train to go to Crowder. And these were just seat cars that we were in here. But we got on those, and then we had sleepers. And then we went to Crowder, and that's where we got our shots and got issued our GI clothes. And I don't know what else could I say about it.
So how was that adjustment for you going from civilian life into military life?
Well, I didn't get homesick.
No?
Like some people.
Yeah.
There was a few people had their families followed them.
Oh, really?
Yeah. There, and then we went from there to Fort Knox. And the same people was there, and then they were at Fort Knox and so forth. But my family, of course, couldn't have done that and wouldn't have done that.
Right.
So anyhow, we were at Crowder a few days. I don't know how many days. Not very long. And then we went to Fort Knox. At Fort Knox, I and the guy from Saratoga stayed together, and the other guys went to a different organization. And I did see one of them. We went from ours to where they were. Fort Knox is pretty big. I think they said there was 70,000 soldiers there at that time. And so anyhow, we went over to them on a Sunday, I believe it would have been. And the organization we were in only had an 8-week basic. The rest of them had 16-week. And so anyhow, our basic training, it was tough for me. For one thing, it was the spring of the year, and it was starting to get hot down there. It gets really hot.
And probably humid as well. That we don't have
you
here.
know, it'd get to like 105 in the daytime and clear down to 95 at night. You'd go take a shower, and you'd just dry till the towel wouldn't hold anymore. And then you put your skivvies on and got in bed, and you'd maybe sweat the whole GI mattress through at night. And so, like I say, we had the short basic. They called it light infantry. So we didn't have any of the heavy weapons. No training on machine guns, mortars, recoilless rifle, any of that.
Well, do you think, you said it was pretty hard on you, but do you think maybe you had an advantage over like the city boys that didn't know hard work like you did, or did you see that at all?
Ironically, I got weaker as basic training went along. I don't know whether I could have survived the 16-week thing. Wow. The first week or so I was really there because coming from a higher altitude and gone to lower altitude, I was pretty strong.
Sure.
But after they run you through what they call guerrilla PT and so forth, that takes all the starch out of you. And where we were, there were two big hills wherever you'd go. One was called Agony and the other was Misery. And leaving the base, you went downhill, but coming back, you went uphill. And there were, I don't know anybody that crapped out particularly. Everybody made it. We had one fella from East St. Louis, I believe it was, and there was no reason in the world that he should have passed a physical. His feet were deformed to where his toes were turned under. His vision was poor, and mentally he was very weak. And this poor guy, he won the award when basic training was over for making the most improvement. He got to where he could do one push-up.
Wow.
So they give him a ballpoint pen for a reward. And yeah, he was a guy. You seen the cartoons of Sad Sack. Well, he was Sad Sack. Like I say, his vision was very poor. He'd be trying to clean his rifle at night, and he'd be wiping his eyes with those oily hands, You could barely see his eyeballs through his glasses, and his vision was poor to begin with. And he thought it was his buddy, this other guy from East St. Louis. And this guy would do everything he could to torpedo this guy. He'd get done cleaning his rifle, and the one time he stuck a wad of steel wool down the barrel. And in the morning they had rifle inspection. Well, of course, you can't see through it. So Harwood got back on KP again. He pulled KP more than anybody.
Yeah.
And so anyhow, the guys in my outfit, they ranged all the way from really good people to people that weren't very good either. And so anyhow, from there, the outfit I was in, I first went to wheeled vehicle mechanic school. That was an 8-week thing.
Per your, did they test you for that? Offer you the options, or you were just told that's where you're headed?
Well, on the day when we did those tests, unfortunately, I was on the truck distributing stuff to the mess halls, so I didn't qualify for it.
No.
But they just took my history and decided that I should go there. And there were different schools. There was cook and baker school. There was medical, and there was mechanics, and there would have been something connected with radio communications, and I don't know what else. So anyhow, I had the 8-week mechanic course, and then the following, after that, they split up again and went to different schools, and they sent me to tank mechanic school, and that was also a 10-week course. So we got done just before Christmas. And so
51?
That would have been 52.
52.
And so then I got to come home for, I think it was 2 weeks. And then I had to go, we shipped out from San Francisco to go to Korea.
Well, now, at that point, are you actually in a unit, or are you going over as a replacement?
Replacement.
Okay, yeah.
Every time I moved, I was alone.
Oh, geez.
Never went with anybody I knew.
Huh.
And when we got through that last school, they divided them up. The married guys got to go to Europe, and all the single guys went to Korea. And so, anyhow, I was home. Just another little note. This wouldn't have been that time. It would have had to been between the two mechanic schools. We had a little short furlough. And I got into Denver at about midnight. And, of course, no bus running or anything. But they said, well, we're running a bus from Denver to Cheyenne, and we'll give you a ride to the junction of what's now 25 and 34. Mm-hmm. That used to be a traffic circle.
Oh, really, yeah?
Yeah. And he said, well, we'll take you to there. Well, I live 4 miles west and 1.5 miles north.
Yeah.
Okay, so I get there like 1:30 in the morning. I walk the entire 4 miles, not meeting or seeing a car in either direction on Highway 34.
Wow.
So I would have been on the road an hour, and nobody went through there. Can you imagine that?
That sounds wonderful now.
So, anyhow, then, after when I had to leave, which would have probably been the first week in January, I had the understanding that the airline would have charged me to take my duffel bag. So as soon as I got home, I went to the railroad and tried to get a ticket on a sleeper.
So you had to get your own way out to San Francisco?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so, anyhow, they run me around, and well, I had to be in Denver at 5 o'clock to catch the train. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the train is sitting here in Greeley. I couldn't get a sleeper. I had to sit up all the way. And it was a slow train. They called it the Pony Express. But anyhow, we went up and through Laramie and across Utah and Arizona, out that way. And I got saddled in a seat. There was a big fat woman next to me. And there was never another seat opened up the entire trip. When I sat there, I had to be like this all the time because she was lapping over. And so anyhow, we get to San Francisco, and we were there, I don't know, a few days, and I really can't tell you how many. But this was in mid-January, and it was foggy and cold and damp. Never saw the sun the entire time. And so then I get the flu. And it's time to get on the ship.
Oh, jeez.
So I get on the ship, and I'm not feeling very good. So I go to medics and ask if they got something for seasick or something. And they thought I was trying to dodge it. They said, well, with your problems, I think you need to see the chaplain. So that's the accommodation I got from the medics on the ship. They did give me a seasick pill, which went down and bounced and came right back up with everything else.
Well, that always begs the question. I mean, here's a landlocked Colorado boy going to sea. I can't imagine what that journey was like for you.
Well, going over was not pleasant because it was really rough. The first night, of course, we leave in the dark, and I wake up and this ship is just shaking like this, And I didn't know what was going on. But what happened, and this was a big, big ship. General William S. Weigel was its name. And I found out later the generals were all troop ships. But anyhow, what was happening, it was so rough that the props were coming out of the water.
Oh, right, yeah.
And then when they go down, it would just shudder like this. Well, anyhow, it was so rough, the heads were all running over. The toilets would run backwards. And, they have a railing, call it this, around each compartment, so the doors don't go to the floor. And there was about 4 or 6 inches of this stuff slopping back and forth. And this lasted the entire trip till we got real close to Japan before the water quieted down. And anyhow, to make things worse, our compartment was chose to serve KP every other day. And you'd go down there and you'd dish out this slop, and you'd turn around and puke in the drain, and then you'd dish out some more stuff. And as I remember, we only had 2 kinds of meal. One was corned beef, and I don't know what went with it, and the other was chili and rice. And those are the only meals I remember. And the only thing that kind of saved our butts is on the days when we weren't on KP. Well, when we were on KP, some of the guys in our compartment didn't have to serve, and we would, everything was carried up from down below. Well, we would bring some of this stuff up and hand it to these guys, and they would stash it, and then we would eat that the next day without having to go through the chow line. Because there were so many people on this ship, you had a colored card, and you only ate when that card come up, but you'd have to stand in line maybe an hour, and just the smell from this thing going through there, if you were well back there, you weren't by the time you got there. And so they would, would bring up a case of canned peaches or something like that, or a sack of oranges, or who knows, and these guys would squirrel that away for us the next day. And That's how I got through, but I didn't feel good all the way going over.
Roughly how long did it take you to get across?
I think we were on the water 14 days.
Oh, gee.
And we got off in Japan. I think it was Yokohama. And that's where they then issued us our combat stuff. And we were only there maybe 2 or 3 days, and then back onto the same ship to go to Korea.
Now, during those 3 days, did you have an opportunity to get out and kind of explore Japan?
No.
Okay.
No. And then we went around into the China Sea, and we got off the ship at Incheon. But Incheon didn't have any harbor facilities or anything. So we got off of the ship onto a barge, and then off of the barge onto LSTs, which took us to shore.
Mm-hmm.
And as I remember, I think it was 38 degrees when we got off of the ship, but by midnight we were into 15 or 20 below zero. And I didn't have any high expectations when we landed there, because everything had been destroyed. All I remember is there was a burned out church up on top of a hill and a few trees without any branches on them. And apparently there'd been a lot of fighting there at one point. So they put us on a train there, and it was pulled by a little engine like the donkey engines the Great Western used to use.
Mm-hmm.
And this thing huffed and puffed all night long. We get to what they called a repo company. And this train didn't have any heat. A lot of windows were missing. And the toilet on those trains was just a hole in the floor.
Mm-hmm.
And which wasn't too different from our trains, really, because our trains at that time, the John just dumped it onto the tracks. That's why the porter always closed the restrooms when you came into town. They'd lock the doors on them, and then once you got out. But you'd flush that thing, and you could see the track down there. So anyhow, we get to this repo company, and this would have been the tail end of January. And it was 15, 20 below zero, something like that.
Did they properly clothe you for it? I mean, were you?
Well, we had a lot of clothes and used every bit of them. They pointed out that we didn't have any heat in the tents because one of them burned down, and they had it there. You see, this is what happens when you have heat in your tent. So I got there, and what you would do, you'd wear all your clothes and everything. We were issued thermo boots, they called them. But at that time, they were rubber outside and rubber inside with insulation in between. But your feet would sweat like crazy in them. You know, I mean, you had to change socks every day. And of course, the story was, well, you carry your old socks in your armpits to let them dry. Well, anyhow, at night, at that time, I still had a air mattress that held air. But you put that down, and you put your shelter half over it, and you put on all your clothes, put your sleeping bag over it, stuff the toe of your sleeping bag into your duffel bag, and then you took your wool muffler and wound that around your face, and that's how you slept.
Jeez.
In the morning when you'd get up, you'd get out of your duffel bag and you'd put on your boots, but you didn't lace them. You run to the mess hall, because that was the only place that had heat. And if you stopped to lace your boots, your feet would be froze. So you do that. And then you truly got these green eggs, the reconstituted eggs, and whatever. and you got a box of cereal, the little boxes you get, you open them, and that was your bowl too. And they'd put this reconstituted milk in there, you know, and it generally would freeze around the sides, the middle out of it. And so we were there, I don't know, about 3 days or so. And then they put us on a truck and shipped us to our units. And I unfortunately was on the back end of the truck, and they had a strap across there, and I was crowded, so I was like this again. And we get to our company, and the colonel comes out of his little tent that's got 2 chimneys on it, and a fur-lined parka and all this, and told us, if you think this is tough, you haven't seen nothing yet. And you could hear in the crowd, boo. And then you had to sign a certificate that you didn't suffer any frostbite or anything, whether you did or not. It didn't matter. They didn't want to be held responsible for anything. So anyhow, then I get to my company, which was called the Wolfhounds. The 25th Division, 27th Regiment. And then I was in Mike Company, M, which was a heavy weapons company. So they had just been pulled, they had been through almost all of the major battles in Korea. This unit had been. And they had pulled back, and most of the company had either been wounded or killed or sent back because their time had run out. As I recall, there was only like 18 people in the company when I got there. Well, anyhow, the company commander looked at me and he said, well, Frank, he said, I don't know whether to put you in the mortars or the machine gun platoon. And I did the only sales pitch in my life. I said, well, you know, they sent me through these 2 mechanic schools, and they told me how much it supposedly cost, like $15,000 a piece to go through there. And I laid on him that seemed like that'd be a terrific waste of funds, you know. The fact is, I had seen a machine gun, never fired one, because one of the courses, they fired machine guns over you and you had to crawl under them. And I'd never seen a mortar. And anyhow, so he finally called the motor sergeant and said, do you need anybody up there? Well, yeah, they needed a driver. So they sent me up there and sent me there as a mechanic. And so I applied for my mechanic's toolkit. 14 months later, when I left, the toolkit had not arrived. But anyhow, they put me to driving a 3/4, pulling a water trailer, or hauling garbage. And I did that till they made me motor sergeant. And anyhow, the equipment we had was all World War II stuff. And these 3/4 we had in our company were absolutely, totally wore out. The one I was assigned to, I put 2 or 3 gallons of oil in it every day. It just run through it, you know. And finally that engine gave out and they put me on another one that was just as bad. And then they were wondering what I was doing to those things. And so anyhow, I pulled a water trailer and hauled garbage. And then when they'd have what they called ration breakdown, I was assigned to go get the groceries and bring them back. And of course, what we would do, since the heavy weapons company had more vehicles than anybody else, we could always get there first. And we always brought an extra guy along, so we stole supplies from the other guys if they had something kind of nice, you know. And So then sometimes we'd have snacks in our tent. And anyhow, when I got in the motor pool, the other guys, they got 5 gallons of diesel for each stove each night. And those stoves were so inefficient that would only run them like a couple hours or something like that. Well, we being a little more inventive and having the opportunity, ours run on gasoline. And we had a 50-gallon drum hid out back and a long hose to our stove so we could have heat all night. And they didn't soot up so bad either. With that diesel, they sooted up terrifically bad. That's another thing. When I got there, this tent had holes in the top, you know. And the few guys that had been there said, yeah, when we were online up here, we got strafed. And that's how that happened. And I believed it, you know, I thought that's true. Well, later on, I found out when your tent stove got sooted up real bad, what you did is you got it as hot as you could, and then you dumped a cup of water in there and slammed the lid on it, and it blew that soot out. But you had to have guys outside with water because everywhere it hit, it would burn through.
Okay.
And that's what had happened.
Oh, okay.
But ironically, they were in a line, you know, which...
How far from the front lines were you?
We were right at it.
Oh, boy.
We were, by the time I got there, the war had stopped going back and forth. And so basically we were in the DMZ zone. But our mortars and machine gun guys were in the trenches right nearby.
Wow.
And luckily, being in the motor pool, I didn't have to do that. But those guys...
Yeah, but you were out and about. I mean, was there any worries particularly? I mean, you didn't know who was friend or foe, I would imagine, among the locals.
Well, that's another thing where we were, no locals were allowed.
Oh, okay.
They were back further. And so the only ones in where we were the Korean military and our military. Well, and everybody else's military. At that time,
right.
Every American division had a unit of somebody else attached. Our division had the Turks attached.
Oh, I was going to ask you about the Turks, yeah.
And they were different. You know, I and the guy that was the mechanic, we went scrounging one day. I don't know what we were looking for, but we went by the Turks. And they're standing out there in their long johns. And I don't know what was going on, but this officer come down and he didn't like something this one guy was saying, and he whacked him, knocked him down, and the guy got up and he knocked him down the second time. And the Turks, of course, they had their crescent on their bumpers on their trucks, and you learn that you get out of their way because they take what they want, and you're immaterial. But before I got there, our unit had a ordnance truck, a 6-wheeler with a van body, and it had lathe in there for turning armatures and stuff like that. And we weren't authorized to have that at all. And I asked how they got it. Well, we swapped it with the Turks up here. They're not responsible for their stuff, you know. Yeah, you can have it. And so, anyhow, later on then, when we moved back and we're back online again, the Turks were right next to us. And all night long they'd be raising hell over there, you know. Their theory was, well, we'll dump out some gas and we'll light a fire and they'll see us and they'll start shooting at us and we know where they are and we go get them. And they'd have our guys hauling ammo all night long. And this happened lots of days, lots of nights, I should say.
Were camp conditions better than the time at the Repo Depot, or what?
Well, because we had heat.
Yeah.
And we had people, the mess sergeant and his crew actually tried to make the food good, as good as you could. On Sundays, you could have eggs fried over. And they made pizza, and they did things that was a little different. The military, they got a book that tells everybody eats this day and everybody eats that day. Well, online there, the people in the trenches, they got breakfast at lunch and lunch at supper and supper at breakfast, because it was hauled up there in thermos cans, and so they were behind all the time. And so they were dug in, some in bunkers, and well, at that time, since it had kind of stabilized, they all had bunkers. They were all dug in, and they hauled big timbers up there and built roofs so the mortars wouldn't come through and all that stuff.
Wow. What would you do for entertainment when you weren't on duty up there? To pass the time and...
Well, they did have movies sometimes. We had a generator. Originally it had been a one-lung light plant or something, and that engine had gone bad, who knows when. So they'd gotten a Jeep engine and had belted it up to the generator, and they would start it up at dark and run it till maybe 10 o'clock at night. And they did have movies, but we had quite a few Koreans with our outfit that was attached to us, and they'd pretty well hog the movie, and it didn't matter to me. I didn't care. And we had radio. The Army had a radio station that played music, basically. You didn't get any news. Not American. You could get Radio Moscow.
Oh, really?
And they told how bad it was in the United States.
Yeah, right.
Everybody's out of work, and and this and that. And I had a Zenith transoceanic, so you could get shortwave, and I think that's how we got Radio Moscow. And the other was just an Army radio station that was somewhere closer. But I think they run, I don't know if they run 24 hours or if they quit at midnight. I don't remember. We never shut the radio off. We just left it turned on.
How about as far as communications from home? Was mail pretty consistent, or?
Yeah. Well, I never wrote home a lot, and parents didn't write much either, But yeah, we had mail call every day. Somebody got mail, and I don't know how long it took to get out. Really don't know that. But
well, how do you, that time in there? I mean, I guess they were okay conditions, but I mean, you look at you're in severe weather. Hygiene probably wasn't the best. The food you said was okay. Probably not getting enough sleep. I mean, any of those things would knock a man down. But then you got the stress of war on top of that. How do you think you made it through that period of time?
Well, the one place we were at, our line, the Chinese or Korean line, was at least a mile apart, and there was a ridge, and the Army engineers had cut a road through there, and that one short distance, the Chinese could see you, and so when you went through there, you went as fast as you could, because invariably mortars would start hitting in the road behind you, and but the joke was, yeah, they missed me again today. Nobody was too upset about it.
Wow.
But the way that was, we went through this one ridge, and then you were hidden by other little hills from the Koreans and the Chinese. And so out probably a quarter mile beyond this ridge, and our line was the ridge. Out beyond it, there was a machine gun platoon, and then another probably quarter mile further was a rifle squad. And so we had somebody that brought them supplies and stuff. And where you were visible, you hurried as much as you could, you know. And in my time, nobody that I knew got hurt. But anyhow, I don't know where this goes. Anyhow, the one escapade, one night, it was my turn to drive the guard jeep for the medics. And out in this area, another company had run into the the Koreans or something and got shot up. So they had two guys that were real bad, and we had to go with the medics out there to pick them up. And so, being like I wanted to be a Rambo, I borrowed a carbine from another guy, because we weren't issued carbines.
You didn't have any protection riding shotgun with you or anything like that?
Well, the other guy had a BAR.
Oh.
And I would have had an M1, but I borrowed this guy's carbine because it was a newer carbine that had automatic, and he had triple banana clips taped together. And I thought, boy, this would really be good if I got in a jam, you know. So anyhow, we go out leading this Jeep. A rainy, dark night. You can't believe how black it can be. Driving with blackout light. And I don't know if you know anything about that.
Those just little slits, right?
Yeah. And if there's not a tree or something there, you can't see anything because it just leaves a mark on something that's ahead of you. Well, anyhow, we're going out there driving in tank tracks. So you're either like this or you're like this. And luckily, the guy that was with me knew where we were going. But we get out there, and as Carson said, the fork in the road. Well, I start turning left, and he says, no, right. And I didn't have enough room to go right, so I went straight. And there was a water hole there.
Oh, man.
And it was so deep that the fan on that Jeep was picking up water.
Oh, yeah.
And this is the old World War II Jeep, not waterproof. But luckily, the guy that this Jeep belonged to, he was kind of an innovator too. He had taken electric tape and taped all around the distributor and around the spark plugs and all this, so it didn't short out on me. And we get a little further, and that's as far as we go. So I and the guy that's with me and the two medics start out in the dark to meet these other people. They're carrying these two guys that are really bad off. And in that mud, they were so exhausted they just couldn't go anymore. The one guy had been hit in the head with a grenade, had part of his face missing. And the other guy had been cut across the gut with a burp gun. And I don't know whether either one of them lived, or I didn't know them. They were from another company and so forth. So anyhow, we helped carry those guys back and get them on the Jeep and go back. And when we get back, why, the medic give me what for driving too fast. Well, nobody had told me anything, and I kept watching back to see if this guy was behind me, and I kept going as fast as I could, and him still keep up, you know. And they said, you don't ever drive more than 10 miles an hour unless they're shooting at you. And so we get there, and the medic jerks the hose off of the windshield wiper of his Jeep and shoves it down this guy's throat because he's strangling on his blood. And that's how they sucked the blood out of him. But I don't know what happened to those guys. I didn't know who they were, and I don't even know what company they belonged to. So that was my experience. But the thing I was going to tell you about this carbine, I borrowed it thinking I've got a lot of firepower. I get back, I find out I couldn't have fired one shot with it. There was a pin missing out of it somewhere, and it wouldn't have worked.
Oh, man.
And they weren't very good in the first place. Usually they'd fire a few and they'd lock up and you had to take them apart. They were, I don't know why they passed inspection, but they only weighed half what the M1 did. And an M1, you only had 8 shells in each clip, And these things with 15 in each, I had 45 of them. I was good to go.
So you thought. Well, now your whole time over there, did you ever get an R&R, or were you?
Yeah, I had R&R.
To Japan?
Went to Japan, to Kyoto, Japan. And, everybody had their visions, but those prostitutes over there had so much VD that was enough to scare me, even though I wasn't as horny as some people, I guess. But anyhow, we flew out of Kimpo Air Base at Seoul. And Kimpo, the runway just run down to the ocean. And at that time, the military was using these transport planes. I think they were called a C-121, a 4-engine plane. And they'd get back to the end of the runway and lock up the brakes, and rev the engines, and then let them go, and they'd start creeping down the runway, They'd get to the end, and they'd pull up their wheels, and as far as you could see them, they're just barely skimming the waves. They were overloaded so bad, and dumb as it is, they made you take your combat stuff with you to go to Japan, which added another 25 pounds to everybody, And but I didn't go on one of those. I flew both ways on the C-47, and by this time, those planes were getting fairly old. And they had holes in them all over, not bullet holes, but they'd had things mounted in them and then taken out, and there was holes. And of course, they weren't pressurized. We flew at like 5,000 feet or something like that. So anyhow, we flew to Japan, and it was uneventful. But coming back, we changed planes 3 times before we got off the ground. We got in the first one, and ordinarily those things, if you got the first engine started, the second one usually started easier because the generators got running and so forth. Well, anyhow, in this one, the first engine started, but the second one never did. So we get out of that. We go to another one. Well, radio don't work. So we sit there, and they get a radio out of some other one and bring it back. Still don't work. So they march us down the runway, and we get another plane. Now, these don't have seats in them. They have like a cot on each side. And you have it's like a life jacket or something that everybody sits on, and these things are, of course, mutilated to where they probably wouldn't work anyhow. So anyhow, we finally get in this third plane, and we get off, and we're gone, and I'm sitting way in front. Pretty soon the light comes on, no smoking, and I'm listening to the pilot and the other guy, and the one says, well, maybe we ought to go back. And he said, well, it don't make any difference. We're in the middle now. So he gets up and goes in the back and opens the compartment and gets a 5-gallon can of oil of some kind, and they open a hatch in the floor and dump it in. So apparently they had a hydraulic leak or something. But we managed to get there, and that was that.
Wow. Wow. So then how long were you actually in Korea?
14 months.
14 months?
Yeah.
Was that the standard tour of duty, or?
They had a rotation thing. If you were in combat, you got 4 points a month. You rotated 36 points.
Okay, so there's still the point system. I know that was big in World War II, but it's still the point system in Korea then. Okay.
Yeah. And so where I was, I couldn't get 36 points in the time I had left to serve.
Really?
Yeah. So they, from the time I got there, these people says, hey, new man, when are you going home? And I says, Well, the end of March next year, Well, how do you know? Well, I hadn't got time enough to get 36 points, And so I think, well, I've got a CIB. So
right.
you have to be
Right.
in a frontline outfit. I don't know whether it's 30 days or 90 days.
Yeah, I think 30. Yeah.
Okay, so anyhow, I was there long enough to get that. But I tell people, well, the company clerk had more medals than anybody because he knew how to apply for them and so forth. So, but I do have that, and whatever other things our regiment was entitled to, But so anyhow, then by the time I was on R&R, the war had ended. I think it ended in June of that year, if I'm not mistaken.
53.
And then we were stationed, I think it's probably about 30 miles north of Seoul. And along the Imjim River. And anyhow, there's a bridge across the Imjim. There was a railroad that run across there, and this was a railroad bridge. But they planked it so you could drive vehicles across, but it was only wide enough to be one way. And then a short distance from us was Panmunjom. And so I was there through part of the prisoner exchange.
Oh, wow.
So every evening they'd bring a trainload of prisoners up. I think America had taken something like 250,000 prisoners. And so they'd bring a trainload of them up and they'd hold them in a compound there. And then in the mornings, we'd take a convoy of them from there to Panmunjom. And I think it was a short distance, not more than 10 miles at the most, but I'm guessing maybe closer to 5. So they would load these, they put a center bench in these trucks, so I think they would haul 30 men at a time. Well, anyhow, our government, to, I suppose, make an impression, we got all brand new vehicles to do this. So this was the new issue, then the GMC truck with the automatic transmission and the new Jeeps and new ambulances. So I'm guessing we hauled about 1,000 of them in each convoy. So there would be 2 trucks and a Jeep with 3 guys in it. We were supposed to be guards, but we weren't allowed to have any weapons. And so they'd load them up and we'd head for there. Well, the first day, they had these tarps on the trucks. The first day, the prisoners untied the tarps, and they were told you don't stop for anything. The trucks would be coming down the road, and the tarp would be dragging out back, And these prisoners, they all tore up their underwear and made little flags out of them. They'd cut themselves and get enough red to make a red star, and they're all waving their little North Korean flag, And one day we were doing this. I was there, I think, 5 or 6 days maybe. And this one day, some dumb second lieutenant says, well, they're not allowed to have those. Take them away from them.
Geez.
So some guy grabs one of these and pulls it down, and boy, these guys come out of the truck. And us guards were a little more innovative. We'd cut up tent stakes, and we each had a billy club stuck under the seat. So we were out there with our clubs, but they really weren't backing down. And finally they got back on the truck. So we took them there. And at the exchange was like a racetrack. And on this side was a hill, and the Koreans had a building up there. And so the prisoners would get off of the truck and they'd go over the hill. Well, at the same time, they'd bring the prisoners they were releasing around the other side. And I never saw a Caucasian being transferred while I was there. They would maybe have as many as a half dozen that they were exchanging for our 1,000. And the ones I seen from a distance, they all appeared to be Orientals. And they'd have maybe an ambulance and a little short truck that looked like a 46 Studebaker. And that'd be the exchange. And I don't know how many trips a day our outfit made. I was only involved one time a day. But by the second day, they rolled up these tarps, and then the prisoners all had razor blades. And they cut up the tarps, and the driver down there, you can imagine him, this guy is cutting the top out of the truck while he's trying to avoid it. And so anyhow, they did that. And a few times we got there, and there was one of the prisoners that had a change of heart and decided he didn't want to go back, and he didn't want to get off of the truck. Well, they drug him up over the hill, hollering and squealing. I assume they killed him when they got him over the backside. But I think they were offered the opportunity to stay in South Korea. But these people apparently were either pressured or just didn't know what they should do. And then, but anyhow, the other thing I want to say about this, the Army issued them all a new pair of boots, a new set of GI clothes, but it did say PW on the back, a new GI blanket, and a mess kit full of rice. And along this road, they got rid of everything. They all got off of the truck buck naked. And this whole road was paved with shoes and clothes and blankets, the whole distance of it. And they'd tie their boots in a bundle, and since there was more than one convoy, some would be coming back while they'd sling them over the side. We replaced every windshield in every vehicle every day. If you didn't have the windshield, they'd take your head off.
Yeah.
You know, a half a dozen combat boots in one bundle. And we're going 30 mile an hour this way and 30 that way, at 60 mile an hour. So anyhow, that's what they did. And then one day we exchanged Chinese, and they were entirely different. They were very docile. They were damn glad to get out of there. They kept their clothes. That's probably the best they ever had in their life.
Yeah.
They kept it with them. They got off with it. No problems whatsoever. And then one day, I wasn't there, but they exchanged women prisoners. And so our Army, being benevolent like they were, being nice, they didn't haul them in trucks. They brought in a fleet of new ambulances. And these women busted the windows out of them, cut up the seats, did everything they could.
Wow.
So, anyhow, that's my experience, the most memorable thing that happened there.
I can't imagine. I mean, for anybody to experience what you'd gone through, but many in your generation, probably had never been 25, 50 miles away from the farm, and now you're halfway around the world in this strange land, seeing these strange things going on, and I can't imagine what that was like for a farm boy to experience.
Well, more on a lighthearted thing. I became motor sergeant. I was a PFC as a driver. They made me a corporal and a motor sergeant, and a week or two later I was a sergeant. I never got paid as a corporal.
Oh, really?
And this might be memorable. I got clear up to $134 a month. That's combat and overseas pay combined. And being an E5 sergeant. But I didn't soldier very good, and I don't think any of the people in the motor pool did. We were kind of outcasts as such. Whenever there was a move done or something, there was never any provision for the motor pool. We were never told anything. You just go. And so we'd go on our own and did our own thing. But anyhow, had this guy came in to be a mechanic. Actually, after I left the States, I never met anybody I knew. But a guy from Greeley came in as my mechanic when I was motor sergeant. And I had known of him. He was a stock car racer. Mm. And before I went to the Army, I went to stock car races every weekend. Well, anyhow, the first thing this guy did was told me how much he could drink. And I'd lived on the thought that a pint would make you unconscious and a quart would kill you. Well, that's not right. Because this guy could drink a quart and it didn't bother him much. So anyhow, in the process, one of the guys in the outfit, he was my main mechanic before, had made connection, and he brought back a case of whiskey. And in this tent of about 15 of us, I suppose there was 10 quarts or 10 fifths bought. Well, I bought one, and I don't drink hardly any. I kept giving it to Jack. I was going to smoke him out, you know. I thought, this guy has to be the world's biggest liar, and I'm going to make sure hey, Jack, have a drink out of mine. Yeah, don't mind if I do. You know, he'd tip it up. Somebody else would give him a drink. Yeah, I'll do that. And he had his own bottle, too. And so anyhow, by the time we went to bed, there was 2 or 3 of them had passed out, and one was really sick. And we had an Indian in our outfit. He's a great big guy. He didn't pass out, but he drank his whole bottle. And it was kind of like having a cow in the tent. You couldn't communicate with him. He just roamed around. He finally wrapped his arms around the stovepipe. You could hear him sizzle. Oh! And he fell over and pulled the stovepipe down with him, you know. And anyhow, it took him about 3 days to get straight. But anyhow, Jack could drink this stuff. We finally started getting beer. The first 6 months I was there, you couldn't get beer either. They said you was entitled to 2 bottles a day or something, but we didn't get any. So we finally started getting it, and since I was in charge, I'd go get it. And, for the first week or so, everybody took their beer, and pretty soon most of them weren't. Pretty soon I had a stack of beer cases sitting next to my cot, you know. But Jack would drink a lot. He had a church key hanging from the top of the tent. In the morning he'd wake up. We were getting this Japanese beer. It was in a bigger bottle. It wasn't a quart, but it was bigger than a beer bottle. He'd uncap 2 of those and drink those before he'd get out of bed. And so anyhow, after a while, I'd always trade my beer for Coke if I could. And anyhow, what I was going to tell, this, my main mechanic had left then. Name was Wallenberger. He was the guy that brought the whiskey in. Anyhow, he left, and he was laughing one day. He said, well, up here at the company, my replacement's there, you know, and he laughed. And this guy was from South Dakota. He looked and talked just like Schultz on Hogan's Heroes. Okay, yeah. Come from a German community, talked Germanish, and looked at everything like Schultz. And so he was mechanicing one day, and he pulled some kind of an inspection. So he had a quart of beer stuck in his pocket on the side of his pants. And so he's squatted down explaining to this officer how he's changing the brake shoes on this Jeep. And this beer is running out, running down between his legs. And I didn't know where that was going to go. I didn't say anything, and this officer didn't say anything. And I thought, man, dodged a bullet there.
I'll be darned. Yeah.
And anyhow, this guy, they never get him to soldier. One of the other guys says to him, his name was Siegfried. and I don't know what his first name was. That was his last name. And we called him Ziggy. And I said, Ziggy, you got to start saluting these officers or you're going to get chewed out. He says, well, that's nothing. I got chewed out by a general this morning. What had happened, he was down at this bridge, and they were riding with somebody, and he was out of the Jeep standing there waiting for somebody to come through, and there was a general come through, and he didn't salute, so the general just stopped, talked to him about it. But what are they going to do? Are they going to send you to Korea?
So there was some good times mixed with the bad, then, I guess.
Oh,
yeah.
People just weren't very serious about stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, and then the oddity was, if you were near the end of your time, why they tried to get you to re-up, And I don't think they even asked me. But the guys in the worst position was the ones that re-enlisted. They give them $300 and 2 weeks in Japan to join them for another 3 years. And they come back in 2 weeks and they stuck them right back in the same hole they got out of. I couldn't understand that.
Yeah. Well, moving forward now, your time's up and you're heading home, and you said that trip back home was a little bit better than going over?
Yeah. The ocean was quieter. We were on quite a little smaller ship. The one going over was over 800 feet long. And if I remember right, I think there was 13,000 on it. And this one was smaller. And of course, by then I was a sergeant. I didn't have to do anything. And I wasn't sick when I got on, so, I didn't feel top of the world, but
yeah,
was okay. And then we come in under the Golden Gate Bridge,
Oh, I've always heard that, yeah.
And I look at it, and I look at this ship, and I don't know whether that's going to go under there or not, And of course, when we go under, it's probably cleared by 300 or 400 feet, I don't know. The bridge is way up there, So we landed there, and I think it was called Camp Stoneman, if I'm not mistaken, is where we shipped out from. And I kind of am a little bit cloudy about getting off of the ship. I know we got issued our pay there. See, the military, they work you over in every direction. I didn't get paid the last 3 months I was in Korea because they couldn't take out income tax if you were overseas. So they paid us when we got here so they could take the income tax out of the previous 3 months. And then coming down the gangplank is two of as good-looking ladies as you can believe, Red Cross, with their hands out, wanting to be paid, And so anyhow, I don't know if we got directly on the train. I just don't remember being in the camp there. Maybe they put us directly on the train. And so we come home by the southern route. And the first stop was Needles, California. And these guys jump off, they say, don't get off the train, we're only going to be here minutes. Guys jump off and run to the liquor store. And they said, well, they had a whole bunch of clerks waiting for them. So they get them out real quick. And these guys were still jumping off, and the engineer was tooting the horn, and they all got back on. So anyhow, we ride along, and we had sleepers all the way. And the train was very efficient and on time, no delays. And we got to, I believe it was Santa Fe. And I look out the window, and here's a whole bunch of Mexican kids out here on the loading dock with their little red wagons. And the guys jumping off of the train and running to the liquor store, And they come back carrying cases of beer, and they had guards on the door that wouldn't let them in with the booze. so they had to leave their booze.
Oh.
And these little Mexican kids load their wagons up. I always remember that. So I guess at that time troop trains were coming through there quite regular. And so we come to Fort Carson down here, and that's where I got mustered out.
Mm-hmm. How was that when you got, well, kind of a two-part question, coming back from Korea? Was there any sort of adjusting to, living in a third world country and coming back to America? Was that much of an adjustment to see that all again? And then further down the line, how was it adjusting once you got out of the service from military life back to civilian life for you?
Well, I didn't consider it was any problem at all. I mean, I knew what it was like before, and I hadn't become dependent on the military or anything. My intention was I was never going to stay there, and I thought I'd just fit right back in. I didn't have any problem with that. But
did you take time off between that gap, or did you get home and get right at it?
Well, yeah, pretty much. I went right back to working with my dad on the farm. And I worked with him my entire working life.
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
So, at any rate, I didn't have any adjustment problem. And as far as taking advantage of the GI Bill, my only thing, the guy that used to be the ag teacher at Loveland kind of recruited me to go to the ag class under the GI Bill. So they'd meet once a week in the evening for a couple hours. And it was just a BS session, And I forget what I got, $25 a month or some such thing, which was money to shoot pool and maybe buy a beer or something. And so I did that for, I don't remember whether that was more than a year or not, but whatever time it was. So that was the extent of what I used the GI Bill. So after that, I was just involved with agriculture till I quit. 76 was the last year that I farmed. So.
And just fully retired or moved on to a different career? Or?
Well, I had a real estate license for a little while, and then different investment opportunities come along. So I've been basically coasting for the last 40 years.
Good. Good for you. Talk a little bit about family, and we'll start to wind down the interview, if you'd like. Children, grandchildren?
Well, yeah. My first wife and I got divorced. We weren't together too long. Then I met my wife here. She was a widow with 3 children. So I have no children of my own. But we now have, is it 17?
17.
We've got 6 grandchildren, 17 greats, and 1 great-great. Which just happened when the oldest great-grand married a fellow that had a 6-year-old. So that's how we got a great-great. Or is that a great-great-great? I don't know. If you live long enough, this stuff happens to you.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So, anyhow, Melly had her kids at an early age, and so. So anyhow, I have one brother living yet. He's 96, and I'm running out of cousins. On my mother's side, I have 1 cousin, and I have quite a few yet on my father's side. My dad was one of 12, and So there's most of them are in the Washington state, but there's a few here in Colorado. Have very little contact with them, however.
Yeah, yeah. Well, speaking of contact, through the years, did you ever keep in touch with any of the guys you served with? Go to any sort of reunions, anything like that?
No. Other than the one that lived here at Greeley, I'd see him occasionally. And when I finally got that thing, I started looking up somebody and found out everybody I looked up was dead. So that's how that worked. But no, I've not been to any reunions or anything. It turns out one fellow that lives up here at Eaton was in the 25th Division also, but he's a year younger than me, and he was in it when it was in Hawaii. They kept telling us we were going to Hawaii, but it never happened.
Yeah, I'll be darned. Well, how, it's the Korean War is considered the forgotten war, and the Korean veteran is the forgotten veteran. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, it's never brought up. And, well, as Truman said, it wasn't a war, it was a police action.
Yeah.
And my feelings of it is it's the first war that the United States decided they didn't want to win it. And so ever since then, they've been engaged in wars that they either don't want to win or can't win. And so that's my view on it.
Yeah. Well, usually the last question, well, actually, I'll ask you, is there anything we didn't talk about or anything I didn't ask you about that you want to, or stories or something that are floating to the top that you want to talk about as we wind down this? Anything we left out that you can?
Not really.
Yeah.
My experience, like having that rifle that wouldn't fire, had I been in a real predicament, I'd probably be one of the casualties, not one of the survivors.
Right, yeah.
Some of those guys lived under pretty atrocious conditions.
Wow.
And, in fact, the same guy that told me they got strafed, and I believe this was true because other people backed it. They were on Old Baldy, and they were on Pork Chop Ridge, and all of the major battles this outfit I was in had been in. And he was telling they were this one place. They'd had a bunker, and they had a plate iron door. And he said, well, every once in a while we whipped that door open and let our machine gun rip straight to the area. He said by the time you got the door shut, they were bullets bouncing off of it again.
Oh, jeez.
Oh, then the funny thing, this one guy became a driver. Before I got there, the company commander would only put people in the motor pool if they got injured or something like that. Well, anyhow, this one guy, we called him Spook. His name was Webb, and I think he was from Chicago. But they said he was on a heavy machine gun. You know, that's the one with the water-cooled barrel.
Mm-hmm.
And from that, they have, when you fire it, this water gets to boiling, and they've got a hose that goes into a gallon can and boils over, and then you put the water back in. Well, anyhow, just to show how guys are, even in combat conditions, they said he'd be on that machine gun, and we'd throw tin cans out there at night. He'd hear this, and he'd start shooting at them. And he said, we got him so excited one time he shot the water can off of his own gun, and you'd almost have to turn that thing around backwards to get that done.
Yeah. Wow.
So, yeah, they played tricks even under the most adverse conditions.
Wow. Well, the last question I like to ask in these interviews, how do you think your time in the Army and in Korea, did that play any part in your life, affect your life at all, or was it just simply just like a chapter that you went through, do you figure?
Well, it'd have to be more of a chapter. Now everybody's got post-traumatic stress syndrome, and back in World War II they had shell shock.
Yeah.
And now I think since you can tap the treasury a lot better, you have a lot more things happen to you. But again, I've never been close to one of those explosions that blows a 10-foot hole in the ground either.
Yeah.
And maybe I don't understand. But anyhow, I don't feel that it particularly affected my life one way or another. People usually say, well, I wouldn't do it again for $1 million, but I'm glad I did it.
Yeah.
I'm not particularly glad I did it.
No.
And the $1 million ain't in the atmosphere, so.
Yeah.
But other than that, I don't really know that nowadays, of course, I understand people that don't have opportunities, they join the Army because they can get a college education and get a leg up, and there's probably more things that you can learn from the military because of all the electronics and so forth that's involved. Some of that stuff you can take home. But when I was there, how to work on a tank engine or how to fire a 105 howitzer, there's not much use for that in the private sector, you know.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of my view on it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Would I do it again? Not if I could help it.
Yeah. Fair enough. Understandable. Yeah. Well, Robert, I want to thank you for sitting down today to tell your story, but just as important, I want to thank you for your service to our country.
Well, I didn't make any big changes in things, I can tell you that.
Well, thank you.